All right, thank you very much. It's a real pleasure to be here today. So I did change the title up on you. I think we're converging to this title. We think we're doing a better job of conveying what we want to actually tell you about with this paper. And so I'm going to talk to you about the teacher value-added metric and kind of two fundamental components that underlie it. Okay, so this is a joint work with Rob McMillan and Uros Petronievich. There we go. Okay. So there's a pervasive sense that many public schools are underperforming, and that's prompted an ongoing search for viable policies to improve quality. And many of those policies are centered along teachers, as we've heard kind of throughout today. And so there's a very large literature in the economics literature that assesses the importance of teachers in the production of student achievement. And the most kind of sophisticated frontier measure is value added, which again, we've heard a lot about today, just a moment ago, to capture kind of the impact of a given teacher. There's also, kind of outside this literature, there's also kind of been a bunch of studies that have looked at the impact of accountability incentives, right? And so a lot of these studies have kind of concluded that there are some kind of positive effects from accountability in a variety of different settings. But, given that second literature, it's reasonable to assume that a value-added kind of metric would contain a signal of an incentive response. But that's actually not the way it's interpreted in the literature, right? So if you take a look at most value-added analyses, you will basically come across this notion of quality, right? So they'll attach, the authors will attach kind of a label, the quality label, but that really kind of starts you down this road of thinking about innate teaching ability or acquired teaching ability, and not some kind of incentive responsive component. And so we're going to view value added in this talk, in the paper it's based on, as a statistic, right? It's not a deep parameter. It is a statistic that depends on two fundamental components. And that first one's going to be an effect that's invariant to the prevailing incentive schemes that are out there. And the second is going to be one that's responsive to them. Okay? So I don't want to have to say that every single time, and I'm going to introduce two labels to kind of give some shorthand here. So the first one is teacher ability. And you can think of that as being incentive invariant as examples: experience, education, professional development, and time invariant kind of teacher value added is kind of the metric that we will have, and I'll tell you how we actually get at that. And the second one we're going to call teacher effort, okay? And this is highly motivated by kind of basic, what we call principal agent models in economics, how we would think about teachers having a type and also taking actions. And so for the action, we're going to call teacher effort. It's an action that kind of could raise scores, right? The energy level, the efficiency of delivery in the classroom, preparation time for lessons outside the classroom, and even the degree of teaching to the test, right? So I'm actually going to tell you something today about the persistence of these effects. Clearly, if we think about these two components, well, assessing the magnitude of each of these components is quite important, particularly for policymakers, because you have finite resources and you want to think about, should we be spending more resources from a particular starting point? Should we be spending more resources on trying to increase the workforce ability, or by introducing explicit incentives to raise effort, right? That is a kind of a policy trade-off. And so we're going to hopefully try and help answer that question today. So we're going to use a simple model to compute the effects of teacher ability and effort as I've just defined them in terms of student scores. And this is kind of a new empirical approach, which is going to build upon the value-added literature. We're going to use exogenous variation from a well-known federal accountability scheme, which I'm not going to kind of leave you in suspense, is the No Child Left Behind scheme that we've discussed already today in just last talk. And we're going to kind of shift focus here to North Carolina. And so North Carolina also started collecting student level data right around the same time as Texas in the early 90s. Very, very good longitudinal data that includes all public school teachers and students over time. And the procedure that we're going to introduce decomposes ability and effort simply by comparing teachers who teach classrooms with higher versus lower fractions of marginal students. I'm going to define exactly what I mean by a marginal student momentarily. and also before and after the reform was implemented. So we're going to kind of try and look at what teachers did beforehand with more or fewer marginal students and compare that to what we see after NCLB is kind of introduced. And we're going to not really rely on too many strong assumptions to carry out this exercise. So in the ideal world, we would use this procedure that I have in very kind of broad strokes described to you, but I'm going to get into in a moment, to just obtain a cost-equated long-run decomposition. So we'd take value added and we'd separate it into an ability component and an effort component, and we'd call it a day. The two key components of this statement here are cost-equated and long-run. And in practice, when you have an incentive reform that's ongoing, which most reforms are, and No Child Left Behind is no exception, it wasn't just introduced, implemented in 2003 in North Carolina and then stopped, it kept going. And also, when you have incentive schemes that have an unknown and potentially non-pecuniary cost, then it's not so simple to kind of just run this decomposition and understand it in the long run, and also make sure that it's cost equated. So what we call in economics the reduced form, where we basically just do this simple regression framework, it's only going to be able to recover the short run effect, kind of the two components in the short run, and without cost equivalence, which isn't such a great thing if you are interested in assessing kind of from a policy perspective the importance of these two components. So to kind of overcome this limitation, we're going to then draw on what we call an economic structure. So we're going to appeal to a model and try to actually tease apart the persistence of each of these components, ability and effort, and also determine a pecuniary equivalent of the reform so we can actually understand how much it costs, okay, to kind of get at this cost equating. There are two generally applicable features that fall out of this analysis. One seems like kind of a no-brainer, but isn't always done in kind of the evaluation of accountability schemes in practice, which is that you can refine the scheme by costlessly making all students marginal if they aren't already. And so this is, again, hearkening back to Steve's point that No Child Left Behind is a proficiency standard-based accountability scheme, and there are many students who are far, far exceeding its threshold, and there are some students who are not. And in economics parlance, we would consider those students non-marginal, because if you direct effort toward them, it's not going to make a difference at the margin. It's going to make a difference for the students who are very close to the threshold, particularly the type of students that you saw in Steve's analysis. Okay, and the other element here is that when you adjust the cost to kind of compare ability and effort-based reforms, well, the ability-based reform applies to a subset of teachers, and this was alluded to earlier today in some of the talks. I'm going to get into more detail here, but the incentive-based reforms apply to all teachers, and so it's scalable in a very different way. Okay, Joe, to give you a preview of the results here, in terms of the incentives value-added link, the school-level reform creates potent variation at the teacher level. It's not entirely obvious that would be the case. This is a school-level reform, but it indeed does, where we're just going to show you, we're just going to plot teacher value added against incentive strength, okay, the proportion of marginal students in the classroom. And that's just a really simple gut check. Do we actually have something here or not? Okay, and then we're going to argue that the evidence is really strongly in favor of this teacher effort interpretation, because we find, kind of, among other things, that the reform does not cause school principals to resort teachers differentially in response, and it also doesn't cause them to alter class size. Okay, so thinking about other inputs. Why don't we think there is resorting of teachers across classes? I mean, we can only be speculative here, but you might think that it's costly in the short run to do this if there's specific human capital that teachers basically understand something about their students or the grade that they're teaching. They've invested in a particular part of the curriculum, and it's not costless to actually switch them. And maybe parents are going to push back against this as well. And in terms of why teachers would respond to this kind of school-level scheme, we speculate that school principals are basically effective managers in coordinating teachers through pressure, and even reassignment, if it indeed is costly, is something that teachers might want to avoid. So to kind of go straight for the results here, just so you can see, E is our effort component, and A is our ability component. And when we basically do this simple, what I call the reduced form regression framework, when we disentangle these two effects, a 1 standard deviation increase in teacher ability buys us 18% of a standard deviation test score increase. Whereas a 1 standard deviation increase in teacher effort buys us a 5% standard deviation test score increase. And so if that was all that I said, if I just stopped it here, then the effort component is kind of accounting for about 1/5 of the total value added effect. Okay? But this is a contemporaneous effect, decomposition, and it's not cost equated. So the next thing we're going to do is we're still not going to have cost equating. We still live in the contemporaneous world, but we're going to do the refinement of the scheme. So that is to make everyone marginal that I said off the top. We're going to say, well, we should actually tailor these targets to where the student is in the test score distribution, because that is a kind of a costless, sensible thing to do. And so this, by design, will make the components of equal standing in terms of explaining the value added. And so, right, because we're doing, by design, we're basically trying to equate the benefits to see what happens here. So starting from that point, now we've got our refined scheme, we're going to say, well, we still don't have cost equating, but we're going to look into the long run now. We're going to actually figure out the persistence of each effect, and then we're going to figure out how much these things matter in the long run. So starting at that 50-50 kind of benchmark here, well, the fact is that effort only persists at about a quarter of the rate of ability. Okay, you're going to see that. And so in terms of benefit, we fall back here where effort is kind of where it began when we were not using the refined incentive scheme. That seems more sensible. When we do this, though, we find that the cost of the ability through the reform for ability that I'm going to go into in more detail is 7 times greater than effort. And when we adjust for that, well, we get this. We get that the effort component is actually highly competitive with the ability component, if not coming out ahead in a variety of circumstances. Okay? So that is a preview of the results. We're going to kind of go through context, data, and variation quickly, theory very, very quickly. I'm going to, like Sarah, try to not do too much in the way of Greek letters here. I'm going to show you the kind of the decomposition, what we do for ability and effort with the contemporaneous effects. We'll talk about persistence and the policy implications that does the cost equating, and then I will conclude. Okay, so context and data, we're going to go through this fairly, well, at least for the data, we're going to go fairly rapidly. In North Carolina, there were 2 accountability incentive schemes going on here. So No Child Left Behind was implemented for the 2002-03 school year on top of the pre-existing, what they call the ABCs in North Carolina. So NCLB, not to belabor the point, it involves penalties for underperforming schools using fixed targets, meaning, again, everyone faces the same target irrespective of where they are in the distribution. And the ABCs, though, was actually already in kind of the sensible realm, right? So if you think sensible is not leaving money on the table, right? Having students far in excess of the threshold, they're passing irrespective of what teachers do, essentially. But with the value-added target, you're basically conditioning on student prior test scores. Okay, so that actually was already existing since the 96-97 school year. And we're actually going to make use of that pre-existing scheme as a way of cost equating. Again, we have very kind of rich data here. All public school students in North Carolina, yearly student level standardized test scores for every grade 3 through 12, 97 through 2005, in fact, before and after, but this is the period we're looking at. This is using a developmental scale to enable kind of comparison over time, and we can talk about whether you believe the state psychometricians, whether they did that job well, but we think they've done a fairly reasonable job here. And then we also have a whole slew of student, teacher, and school characteristics. Okay, so we understand the education of the parents of the students. We understand the student's gender, their race, their disability status, limited English proficiency, and a measure of economic disadvantage, as we see through free and reduced price lunch. Okay, so if you want to analyze ability and effort, try and disentangle these effects, well, the first thing I want to show you is that NCLB actually did induce an incentive response. If there's no response, then I'm not going to be able to really do much here. Okay, so surprised there is a response. And I'm going to show you that in a picture in a moment. And then conditional on that response, we want to know, we want to plot teacher value added versus incentive strength, as I told you before. So for the first picture, that's not really the point of this paper. It draws upon its sister paper, which is also an MBR working paper. We're going to infer effort as a function of what we call ex ante incentive strength. So we're basically trying to predict where a student is with respect to the target beforehand. So effort is going to be the difference between the ex post realized score and this ex ante predicted score. So we say, where should students score if this No Child Left Behind didn't come in? And then we say, what was the actual score that included the No Child Left Behind response? And that difference is kind of the response, right? And we're going to kind of attach the effort label to that. And as a measure of incentive strength, we're going to say, well, we've still got this ex ante predicted score, and we can just calculate the difference between that and the fixed target because we know what that fixed target is. And then we'd expect marginal students to have performance that's kind of close to the target that's predicted. And so we'd expect the response to be very large when the target and the prediction are close to each other. And that's what we find here. And so this is in 2003, and this is just a non-parametric plot think of this as the response to NCLB. It's the difference between the realized score and the predicted score. And here is kind of the prediction and the target. And so when that's 0, that means they're the same. And so, these are the students who are very highly marginal. And you see that's exactly where it peaks. Okay? Now we run this whole analysis beforehand, and we kind of get essentially a flat profile as a falsification test. Okay? This is from another paper, but we're going to exploit this as a motivating evidence. Okay, so now let's see how teacher value added depends on incentive strength. The steps here, we're going to calculate the fraction of marginal students within the classroom, and that's going to kind of entail setting some kind of bandwidth around that 0 in that picture I just showed you, and we are very robust to different bandwidths, and we're going to call those students within that bandwidth marginal, and those who are outside that bandwidth non-marginal. Okay? And then we're just going to estimate teacher year fixed effects according to the best methodology that exists right now, and we're just going to plot them. Okay, we're going to plot those value-added metrics against the proportion marginal, and this is what it looks like for 3rd grade, and 4th grade, and 5th grade. Okay, so this is pretty highly suggestive that teacher value added is not some kind of immutable metric that is this kind of quality or ability notion. There's some element here where, as you might have expected, knowing the accountability literature, that kind of the incentive response should be baked into this metric as well, and it appears to be. So we could stop there, but there are a few things that we want to use of more formal analysis to rule out kind of some explanations here. And so we want to be careful about differential sorting of students to teachers. We want to be careful about kind of evolving teacher experience, and also just kind of random classroom shocks. And so a lot of times when people are computing teacher value-added measures, they will take averages across many years to get rid of the fact that there's variability when the sample size is relatively small in terms of the number of students that teachers are teaching. And so we want to be kind of very careful in terms of the fact that there may just be random classroom shocks from year to year, and we want to net those out. So we're going to account for these factors and separately identify teacher ability and effort contemporaneously. And then we'll use structure to go after the persistence, as I said. In terms of theory, I'm not going to kind of go into detail here, but we're going to think about an education production technology, so relating inputs to outputs, so kind of things like class size, teachers, things like that, to outputs like test scores. We're going to think of this as cumulative with a linear technology approximation, so we're going to basically say we can add these inputs together and not interact them, which is kind of usually what most of the literature here does. And we're going to kind of allow for contemporaneous and kind of follow-on dynamic effects of unobserved teacher ability and effort. The second kind of component of the theory is that we're going to have teachers make a decision, right? They're going to take an action in light of the accountability incentives, and that action is going to depend on the incentive scheme that's in operation. They're going to balance greater rewards against the convex cost of effort, effort that gets increasingly costly as you exert more of it. And so effort lo and behold, is going to depend on the degree to which students are marginal, and it's going to reproduce, theoretically, a picture very similar to that first one I showed you, where it kind of peaks at 0. Okay? So the strategy here, how do we actually go about disentangling these two effects formally? We're going to compute the teacher year fixed effects from 97 to 2005 every single year, and we're going to call that Q hat. So, and we're going to use kind of grade-specific regressions. We're going to regress flexibly on prior scores, teacher fixed effects, and a whole slew of student covariates, so the types of covariates that I said before, like parental education. And then we're going to basically say, well, this teacher fixed effect, this value-added metric, will depend on the ability of the teacher, kind of the incentive invariant component, the baseline effort, so, well, there should be baseline effort anyway, but there's also kind of this pre-existing accountability reform, the ABC's reform, so we'd expect there to be some effort beforehand. And then the over and above response to NCLB, and then the classroom shock. In the second step, we're going to actually use the pre-reform data and estimate that the combination of the first two components. So basically the ability of the teacher and the baseline effort. We're going to package that together and get kind of a metric for every single teacher in North Carolina and kind of tease this apart from the classroom-specific shocks that I alluded to earlier. And then in the third step, we're going to regress our value-added measure on the proportion marginal M. And we're going to hold constant the incentive invariant ability and baseline effort that I just said we identified from step 2. And we're going to also condition on teacher experience, which we know is important here. And then whatever the coefficient in here in this simple regression is on the proportion marginal, we're going to take that estimate, multiply it by the proportion marginal for a particular teacher, and that's their effort. Okay? So here's what the distribution of the ability component looks like for this decomposition. There's not a whole lot to take out of here except for that headline number, which is that it kind of accounts for 18% of a student level standard deviation in test scores across 3rd through 5th grade. And now we're going to kind of do kind of the second components to get at effort. And so I'm going to show you some pictures that look very similar to the pictures I just showed you, but now with all of these kind of formal corrections and also kind of a falsification that looks at what happened before any of this came into play. So marginal students should receive the largest amount of effort. If we condition on teacher ability, the value-added metric, the teacher year fixed effect, should be increasing the fraction of marginal students M. And we see that in 2003, but we don't see that beforehand. And so here's what it looks like in 2003, and here's what it looks like beforehand in 3rd grade and 4th grade and 5th grade. Right? So this is actually exploiting comparisons between teachers with varying proportions of marginal students over time. And you might be concerned that this is just picking something up across schools. It could even be attributed to school principals, for instance. And so to kind of really hit this point home that it is not, and it really is the teacher, we're going to actually look at within teacher year fixed effects. So we're going to look at, for a particular teacher, we're going to look at a change in her value added from one year to the next and plot that against proportion marginal. And the pictures are going to look very similar. They're completely indistinguishable from their level-based counterparts, the ones I just showed you. Okay, so these are the pictures here for 3rd grade and 4th grade and 5th grade. Okay, so hopefully that should have convinced you that this is a teacher-level phenomenon and that the incentive varying component, which we're calling effort, is actually a very real kind of non-trivial component of value added, not something you really want to ignore when you're using these analyses. Okay, we might be concerned here that school principals are resorting teachers in 2003, but we don't find any evidence of that because we regress the proportion marginal on the ability and inability, our metric, and it interacted with No Child Left Behinds indicator coming on, and they're just not statistically significant. Okay. There is, however, as you might expect, the non-interacted part is that school principals absolutely do sort teachers and students. It's just not something that changes when NCLB comes in. Okay? And that's exactly why we want to control for control for it in the main specification. We want to control for ability before we do this decomposition. And so these are the effort distributions, and kind of the headline number here is that kind of the test score raises by half a scale point, which is equivalent to 5% of a student level standard deviation in test scores. So this is I already shared with the 18, and this is the 5, right? These were the two headline numbers at the beginning. Okay, so we've gotten to the point where we can do this decomposition in the short run without cost equating. Now I want to kind of get the long run here, right? So the ability, trying to tease apart the persistence rate of ability and effort is the ability component is not new. We're going to draw upon existing literature, namely Raj Chetty's work and John Friedman and Jonah Rockoff's work, where we just trace out value-added's effects over subsequent years, future test scores. The effort component is going to be a little bit more complicated, okay? And so we're going to go through these each in turn. The ability one is going to produce a picture with our data that looks, if anyone's ever seen the Chetty et al. Paper, this picture will look almost like we took it from their paper, but is actually with completely different data, not from New York, but in North Carolina. And so what's happening here is the effect kind of on test scores contemporaneously of value added is 1, meaning it persists at a rate of 1 today, because it is today's measure. And if you go out one period, it kind of persists at a rate of 40%, then kind of 30%, and it starts leveling off at a kind of 20% range or slightly less. And with their excellent work with the IRS data, they've been able to demonstrate that that goes far, far out over here with income when they start seeing students work later once they enter the labor market. Okay, and so that's kind of the ability component. And just kind of to note, you can look backwards, and you really should not expect an effect going backwards. You should not expect a teacher to be able to affect 2 periods ago, and thankfully that's the case in our data as well. Okay. Okay. The persistence of teacher effort, this is much more challenging. I said this a little earlier. The ideal experiment here, we'd want to just repeal NCLB and ABCs, the 2 accountability reforms in 2004 and beyond. Then you'd have no future effort decisions made. You could just redo exactly what I did for the ability that Chetty, Friedman, Rockoff did. We just do it again for effort. But that's just not the case. And so because they continue to operate, there's some kind of non-trivial issues here, because in 2004, there are 2 reforms actually still at play. And there's this persistence that we're actually trying to nail down, right? That the effort persisted from 2003 to 2004. So there's essentially 3 effects that are highly correlated with each other in 2004, and so we have to tease those apart. So I'm not going to kind of go through in great detail here, but we're going to use a structural estimation approach. We're going to control for the contemporaneous test score effects that stem from those 2 ongoing programs, while estimating the 2003 persistence rate of the 2003 initial effort response. And so we're going to be basically accounting for the fact that the contemporaneous NCLB effort response in 2004 is itself a function of the persistence rate of which we are trying to estimate. This is a very complicated thing, but you can actually tease it apart. And when you do, we find that the persistence rate of effort is 10% of the initial effort after 1 year. And so as an exercise, we can basically take this to be a quarter of what the ability persistence rate is in that picture you just saw. So effort's persisting, but it's only persisting at a quarter of the rate that the ability component is persisting at. Okay? And note, just as kind of a side point here, if for any analyses that look at newer, look at like the follow-on year and try to get a sense for what's happening with contemporaneous responses to the reform ongoing, that's baking in this persistence. And when you don't account for that, you way overestimate by a factor of 4 what it looks like the reform's still doing. So if you account for the fact that there's persistence, you'll correctly understand that actually the follow-on response is far less than you might have thought. Okay. Okay, the second thing here is, effort does decay at a faster rate, but it's not 0, right? So, some people will just say teaching to the test and call it a day and say, well, effort doesn't matter in the long run. It's great that you got this decomposition now, but it just doesn't matter in the long run. And the fact that it's not 0, that it is smaller, but it is non-zero, we think we're actually identifying kind of one of the first works in this space to kind of identify the extent of teaching the test kind of empirically here. Okay, so now I want to move on to the policy implications quickly to kind of get a cost equating, right? So we've done the long run, we've moved from short run to long run, we have yet to kind of cost equate. And so to do that, we're going to kind of draw on the policy debate here. And so for the ability side of things, we're going to focus in on the main kind of policy that speaks to kind of teacher ability, which is to gain a redraw, to kind of get a redraw of the teacher. So you basically fire the lowest rated teachers, and this is somewhat controversial, but you fire the bottom rated teachers, and then you get on average, you get the average teacher draw in return. So and you could also try and kind of retain higher rated teachers, but that's actually in the literature shown to be more expensive. So we're going to focus on the firing of the lower rated teachers. Okay, so Chetty et al. Actually argued the former is more cost effective. We're not making that argument, but that's what we're going to kind of go with here. If you do that, then going from a bottom 5% to an average draw is a 2 standard deviation increase in kind of the ability draw for that subset. To do that, though, you've got to compensate all teachers, not just those bottom 5%, but you've got to compensate all teachers for the increased employment risk, and that kind of an estimate in the literature here is paying all teachers, 1.5% more in terms of their salary to equilibrate the teacher labor market. Now, of course, so that's kind of the benchmark. We can also think about the incentive reform for effort. And if we want to get to that same 2 standard deviation through NCLB, then we're going to do, the first thing is we're going to make everyone marginal. And that gets us to 1.6 standard deviations of the ability effect. So we're going to have to then ratchet up the sanctions by 25% to get to the 2 standard deviations, so it's the same. And there's a lot of math that's involved here, but what you do with the effort-based reform, it's going to apply to all teachers, unlike the ability-based reform that only applies to 1/20th of the teachers. And in the ability-based reform that applies to only 1/20th of the teachers, costs about $700 based on the average salary in North Carolina of $50,000. Okay, so you can think about scaling our sanction by kind of dividing by 20 to get an equivalent value. Okay, and I'm going to say that in a few different ways. So the incentive-based reform would be more cost-effective in the short run if the monetary equivalent of NCLB sanctions were less than, a little more than $11,500. And in the long run, we're just going to multiply that number by that 0.24, the fact that effort persists at a lower rate, kind of. Okay, so then it's about $2,800. So that'd be great. It's great that we have this benchmark, but what actually is the monetary equivalent of the sanctions? To figure that out, we're going to use a bridge between NCLB and ABCs. So ABCs, if you recall very quickly, that slide went by, entails paying teachers bonuses. So that it actually is pecuniary in nature. And we're going to basically use the fact that if you respond strongly to NCLB in 2003 as a teacher, you actually undercut your ability to do well with respect to the ABCs because it's value added. And so you're giving up some money, you're leaving some money on the table. And so there's kind of this policy bridge between these two. And so rather than being a nuisance, we're taking full advantage of this pre-existing policy to help us throw a monetary value on this. Okay, so there's a lot of detail here, but basically you lower your probability of passing ABCs, as I just said. The amount that you lower it is going to be, so I'm going to tell you exactly how much you lower it right now. So when you lower by going harder at NCLB in 2003, teachers lowered their rate of passing the ABCs by between 9 and 32 percentage points, depending on how important you think, how much you think scores are noisy. Okay, depending on the assumptions of the amount of kind of noise from year to year in scores. This corresponds to an expected financial loss for teachers in the average school between $68 and $240. Remember, $700 is our benchmark for ability-based reforms. NCLB sanctions that are valued between $458 and $640 basically are, so the valuation is between these two measures, and we're using a relationship between ABCs and NCLB to get that. I'm not going to belabor that point because I'm running out of time. But let's just take the most pessimistic version of that, right? So the one where noise plays an incredibly small role, far smaller than we actually think it does. So 1640 is that upper bound, and that number is below both of those kind of benchmarks that I set before, the 11,666 and the 2,800 in the long run. So at least in this kind of exercise, the incentive reform is more cost effective than the ability-based counterpart. You should invest, at least in this part of the support, you should invest more money as a policymaker on the incentive-based reform than this ability redraw. Or put another way, the per teacher sanction amount is 59% of the ability-based $700 cost. Okay? Okay. And again, this can scale to all teachers. It doesn't just affect the bottom 5%. That gets less and less effective as you move up the distribution. Okay, so just to conclude, the approach that we've set out here, we kind of argue allows us to compare these leading rival policies in education. It separates key components of teacher value added, effort and ability as I've defined them. It uses a structural model to get at this persistence rates differentially and also place costs on a common footing. We think the evidence strongly suggests that there's an effort response by teachers, and it looks like there is some teaching to the test, but it's not all encompassing, that there's still this signal that comes through. And with that signal that comes through, the incentive-based reform is highly competitive with the ability-based reform, which we think can help move the policy conversation forward. Thanks a lot.
Hi.
Hi.
I did a paper that was less technical, but sort of in the same vein, about Minnesota's QComp, and some of this reminds me of the findings, which was that QComp's an incentive pay reform, and we found that you get about a 3% of a standard deviation increase on test scores, which when we presented this sort of publicly, everyone said, oh, that's so small, but then we said, oh, but it's so cheap, right?
Yes.
Because this was for about $250 per student. And so when I look at your conclusions, that resonates with me about that in the policy conversation, to take this work out into the field, then it can be a bit of a sell to say there's something here, even though it's small, it's very affordable.
That's exactly right. So again, we think there's a lot to be made here about the scope, that it can be kind of set to all teachers, and also, yeah, just on a kind of per teacher basis, it can be less costly. And for that reason, you have to think about scaling that when you do it. Yeah, that's great.
I'm curious if asking teachers to make a lot of effort year after year would predict like turnover or burnout, or similarly,
yeah.
if it's a different thing when you're asking it of first and second year teachers versus more experienced teachers.
Entirely fair. I think, this is why I want to kind of, the caveat at the end is moving the policy conversation forward. I think kind of another fair comment here, which is related, is that you can, I think when you said burnout, there's this element of basically messing with the intrinsic motivation of teachers just by paying for it. And so there needs to be more work to understand this. But I think like as a basic point here, we have this framework to actually take them apart. And in terms of the long run, there needs to be more work to be done, kind of go further into the future. It gets very complicated in a hurry. In this particular setting, but there may be other settings where these reforms stop. In particular, North Carolina, the ABCs one finally stopped in 2009, so we might be able to kind of exploit that. Thanks.
So I think it's important to note the QComp thing in Minnesota, because the biggest chunk of QComp is peer observations, peer support, collaboration, and all of these other things, and it really is not test-driven. It's a piece, but there's a whole bunch of other pieces to it. So I think, to tease those things out would be really important. And I don't know what North Carolina is doing.
Yeah, there was a lot more latitude with QComp than the ABCs in North Carolina. So North Carolina, this money is for this. The bonus goes straight to the teachers and the school principal if the school kind of makes progress in value add. With QComp, as I understand it, there's a little bit more latitude in how the spending goes. And so in terms of how much actually made it to the teachers, that's not necessarily the full funding, the full amount of the funding. But I defer to others who know it better. I see.
Teachers get the money, but
Okay.
for also participating in the collaboration, peer
There are other
observation,
elements, is what you're saying.
Professional
Okay.
development.
Yeah. So the North Carolina one's pure in the sense that it's just the
Just
value-added
about
metric.
tests.
So that's what you're asking. Yeah, that's right. Great. Other questions?
So you're right. I know that, yeah. And when we did that paper, I remember thinking, it's a while ago we did, but we remember thinking about whether or not we were getting an effort effect, like you were thinking, and we wondered if we were getting any kind of selection or sorting effect too, because like the long-term theory on performance pay is that maybe it would sort different types of people into the profession. And you alluded to some like movements within the school, but did you do anything to think about whether there were any kind of changes in the influx and the exit of who's in the profession or who's
Yeah,
in
so
the
we
district?
don't see anything on that margin in 2003. In the longer term, it may be the case. I think that thing that helps us is that North Carolina had this scheme in place 7 years before No Child Left Behind came in. And so if you're thinking about accountability as really changing the types of teachers who want to enter, you might have thought that would have happened earlier. And I think there might be a little evidence to that effect. Yeah. All right. Thank you very much. That's great.